Hello and welcome to our Trainz route building tutorial series. In this series I'm using TRS 19, but most things also apply to other Trainz versions. In this video I'm covering Trainz, consists and placeable cameras. So let's begin by loading our route. Now, as you might expect, Trainz can only be placed on tracks, so let's add some tracks. To access Trainz, click on the Trainz tab on the right, which is the bottom one. Here you can see a list of all the locomotive and rolling stock assets that are currently installed. So let's place some assets. First I'll place a locomotive. For example, let's choose the KS81DI3A asset. If you click on a piece of track with the Add Train tool selected, you can see that the locomotive has now been placed. Above the locomotive you can see a red and a green arrow. This indicates the direction that the train is facing. So now let's add some carriages behind this locomotive, but we don't have enough space here, so we'll need to move the locomotive using the Move Train tool. Now let's select some carriage assets. For example this one, the L&N Coach 3206 asset. So if I place this close to the locomotive, you can see that the red arrow has moved to the rear of the train. This indicates that the two are coupled together and act as one train. Now at first glance, this coach fits quite well with this engine, but if you look closely, you can see that the locomotive has two buffers and a hook and chain coupler system. However, if you look at the coupler of the coach, you can see that it has a knuckle coupler. So even though in Trainz these two can couple together perfectly fine, they don't actually fit. So let's choose a different coach. Okay, so I found a different asset, which is the GWR Corridor 1st/3rd brake coach. So now if I place this here, you can see that this asset also has two buffers and a hook and chain coupler system. So if we look over here to the couplers, you can see that they fit together much better. That's not to say that this coach and this locomotive would have ever existed on the same train, since they're from two completely different parts of the world and periods in time, but at least they would be able to be coupled together. Next, let's go over to the Rotate Train tool. Now with this tool selected, you can click on a piece of rolling stock or locomotive that's been placed down to flip it. This tool does not rotate the entire train, even though it's called the Rotate Train tool. Next is the Get Train tool. With this selected, you can left click on a piece of rolling stock or locomotive you've placed down, and you can see it brings me back to the asset. If you select the Get Train tool and then right click, it turns to the Get Pick List tool, which if you left click on an asset that's been placed down will automatically be added to the pick list that's currently selected. Right click the Get to Pick List tool to go back to the Get Train tool. The tool to the right of that is the Delete Train tool. With this selected, you don't delete the entire train, but instead if you left click on a placed piece of rolling stock or locomotive, it only deletes that piece. Next is the Decouple Carriage tool. With this selected, if you look along your train, you can see these knuckle coupler icons where two pieces of rolling stock are coupled together. If you click on one of these icons, you can see that it's changed to an open knuckle coupler, which means that these are now two trains. This is also indicated by the arrows which have appeared on top of the train where it has been decoupled. If I go back to the Move tool, I can now move these independently. If I want to couple these again, I can just move these over so that they're touching and release. If you have a decoupled train that's already touching and you want to couple it back up, then you can simply go to the Decouple Carriage tool and click on the knuckle coupler icon again. As you can see, the two have now been coupled up again. Next is the Edit Properties tool. With this selected, you can click on a piece of rolling stock or locomotive that's been placed down. For example, I'm going to click on this locomotive here. At the top you've got the basics, so the name, the layer and the bound layer, but below that you get into train specific things. The first is train priority. This will affect which train gives way, and also which tracks the train chooses if you've placed down track priority markers, which we've covered in the last video. Below that you've got headlights on true or false. As you can see, the headlights turn on and off on the locomotive if I toggle this. Below that you've got high beams on true or false. If I enable headlights, you can see that with high beams on false, the lights at the front of the locomotive are dim, If I turn high beams on to true, you can see that the lights become brighter. Below that you've got classification. This is for locomotives that support classification lights. The properties we've just covered affect the whole train. The properties below that are specific to the locomotive or carriage that you clicked on. Here the first setting is engine, and it says default. With this you can basically switch out the engine specs of a locomotive. For example, if you have a locomotive that looks really good and you want it to pull a very heavy train but it's not strong enough, you can click here where it says default and select the engine specs of a different asset. So for example, you could select the EMD GP9/F9 engine spec and then click on the check mark, and what this will have done is that this locomotive now performs as an EMD GP9/F9. Below that is running number. This is the identifying number displayed on a locomotive. To demonstrate the running number, I'll choose a different locomotive asset, as this locomotive does not support this. This locomotive, which is a Baltimore and Ohio F7, also known as a B&O F7, does support running numbers. So with the Edit Properties tool selected, I'll left-click on the front locomotive, and I'll just enter a running number here. So for example, let's choose 007, and click the check mark. Now, as you can already see in the background, the locomotive is now displaying the number we entered. Note that if I go back here, this locomotive is not displaying the same number. Now, another thing that you might have noticed is that I've changed out the GWR carriages for some BPRR hoppers. I've done this for two reasons. One is that these locomotives use the knuckle coupler system, since they're American locomotives, and the GWR carriages are using the hook and chain coupling system. Since these BPRR ore hoppers are also from North America, they are also using the knuckle coupler system. As you can see, these fit quite well together. The second reason is to demonstrate cargo loads. As you can clearly see, these hoppers are empty at the moment. But if I click on them with the Edit Properties tool selected, you can see that at the bottom of this window there is a load type. In this instance, coal. If you click on the number behind units, you can change how much this car is loaded. So for example, if I want this to be fully loaded, I can just type in 9999999 and then click the check mark, and it will max out to the max load of this car. Now if I click the confirm button, you can see that this car is now loaded with coal. Now if I want the entire train to have this same load, I can click on the car that's loaded and then click on this copy to other compatible vehicles button. As you can see, all cars or wagons in this train that support this cargo type have now been loaded to the amount that this car was loaded. Now let's move over to consists. In Trainz, consists are assets that are basically saved trains. So if you have a configuration of a train that you like or that you want to reuse somewhere else, or that you want to be spawned at portals, then you need to make it into a consist. So let's make this train into a consist. To do this, we need to go over to the consist mode, and then click on the Get Consist tool, and click on a train that you've placed. Here you will be asked to give this new consist asset a name and a description. You have to give the consist a name, but you don't have to give it a description. So let's name our new consist. I'll just name it 007 and coal. As you can see on the right panel, the train 007 and coal has now been added. So let's place this down on a new piece of track. As you can see, this train has now been placed. But if you look closely, you'll find that there are a few differences. The first difference is that the cars don't retain their loads. So if you want to spawn in a train using session rules that is loaded, then you will have to use a driver command or session rule to load the train. Another thing is that the running number is kind of here, but not completely. Now let's go over the consist tools. The first is the Move Consist tool, which does exactly the same thing as the Move Train tool. Next is the Rotate Consist tool. With this selected, if you click on a train, you can see that the whole train is now flipped, instead of only the single car or locomotive that the Rotate Train tool flips. Next is the Get Consist tool, which we've already talked about. and then we go over to the Change Heading tool. With this selected, if you click on a train, you can see that the arrows above the train change direction. This means that, for example, if I change this train's heading this way, then this is now the front end of the train, and this is the rear end, and Trainz will handle it as such. So if you put the reverser into forward gear and drive, then the train will drive this way, even though the locomotives haven't actually been rotated. Next is the Delete Consist tool. With this selected, if you click on a train that's been placed down, the whole train gets deleted. After that we have the Decouple Carriage tool, which does exactly the same thing as the Decouple Carriage tool in the Trainz menu. If you've saved a consist and you want to change the name, select the consist in the list and then click the Rename button. Here you can change the name of the consist. If you've made a consist and you want to delete it, select the consist and then click Delete. This will delete the consist, and this action cannot be undone. Lastly, let's quickly touch on Placeable Cameras. If you go over to the Tools tab, you can see that there is a camera section here, which contains the Place Camera tool, the Move Camera tool, the Delete Camera tool, and a drop-down where you can change between static and tracking. With these tools you can place trackside cameras that you can view the train through when driving on the route. To place a camera, first select whether you want this to be a static camera, which means that it will not change the angle if the train drives past, or you can choose tracking camera, which means that it will rotate to follow the train as it goes past. Then select the Place Camera tool and get the camera in kind of the position that you want, and then left click on the terrain. Now we are positioning the camera the way we want. So for example, if we want the camera to be roughly around here, and we want it to be a tracking camera, then we just need to go over and select the Place Camera tool again, and now the camera has been added. Now if we go into Quick Drive by clicking on the Tools menu at the top of the screen and then clicking Quick Drive, you can see that, well, 1, the camera is invisible in Driver, and 2, if you press the 3 key on your keyboard, you will go into Line-Side Camera View. As you can see, the camera has now been positioned exactly to where the camera was that we've placed. Now, if I just quickly drive this train forward, you can see that the camera is tracking the train. Now let's say that we like the placement of this camera, but we'd rather have it be static. To change this, we need to go back to the Tools tab, select the Move Camera tool, then left click on the camera we've placed, and then change the type to static and click the Place Camera tool again. As you can see, the camera is now red, indicating that it is a static camera. Now if we go to Quick Drive, and go back over to the Line-Side Camera tool by pressing 3, you can see that if I start to drive, the camera does not track the train. Now to delete a camera, as you might have already guessed, you need to go to the Tools tab, click on the Delete Camera tool, and then left click on a camera. That covers the basics of Trackside Cameras, but there is one more thing that can help with their placement that I would like to mention. On the download station, you can find 2 assets. One is called Guide Camera Sphere, and one is called Guide Camera Static. Now if you select one of these and place it down, you can see a guide which helps you to see the distance that a camera will track a train from. The Sphere guide is for tracking cameras, and the Static guide is for static cameras. And that's the end of this video. So thank you for watching, I hope it was helpful.